All right. Moving along with our next speaker, we have William Candillon. You might know him from his YouTube videos. He does a series of videos called Can It Be Done with React Native. In those videos, he tries to recreate popular interactions from other apps using React Native, often using React Native Gesture Handler and Reanimated. So definitely check his channel out. And if you enjoy his videos, don't forget to smash the like button and subscribe. And yeah, with that, we'll pass it on to William. All right, William.
Thank you. All right. Hello, React Native developers. What is going on? Thank you so much for having me today. And welcome to Can It Be Done in React Native. Can It Be Done in React Native is a YouTube series that emerged from the fact that after starting React Native development, I started to look at the apps on my phone very differently. For every delightful user experience, I would be wondering, how could we build the same user experience using primitives that we know from the React Native world? So in each episode, we look at an app that people know and love, and a particular user experience from that app. We discuss why the example is exciting to look at, and how we would implement it in React Native. And finally, we do the actual implementation. So today, I would like to do three things. First, to discuss the rules of the game. What qualifies an app as being, or a user experience, as being doable or not doable in React Native. Then, we can look at some of the recipes and common patterns that emerged while doing the show. And finally, we can look at an example together. And we start with the rule of the game. So the rule of the game is, of course, to run the effect or animation at 60 FPS, even on low-grade Android devices, using declarative gestures and animations. Christoph, in React Europe 2018, made a talk on this topic, which I strongly recommend you check out. In his presentation, Christoph makes a very strong and elegant case for the need of declarative gestures and animations in React Native. Recently, someone tweeted at me, "Oh, William, your video inspired me to build this demo in React Native," and he shared with me a snack of the code, and when I looked at the implementation, it was using the pan gesture handler from React Native. And my first reaction was, oh no, I didn't make a strong enough case for declarative gestures and animations. But Christoph did, so I recommend you check out his presentation. And when we cannot use declarative gestures and animations, we should try to be clever about it. Let's look at three examples. So the first one is a simple card animation, but here everything is done declaratively. There's no JavaScript code running. Life is good. But life is not always that easy. In this example, we need to use JavaScript in order to update the values in the cursor. And we can use setNative props to do this without triggering a re-rendering on the React side. It's going to work great on iOS devices because they're pretty powerful, but then you're going to start dropping frame on Android. And here we need to do some sort of smart scheduling, maybe using requests, animation frame, some throttling, and finally we can get also to 60 FPS on Android. Here's another example, which is a play button from the Headspace meditation app. And there's a couple of ways we can implement such animation. The first one is going to be to draw the circle as an SVG path, interpolate the path using JavaScript, and again, using a combination of setNative props and some scheduling to animate the button. It kind of works, but it's pretty inefficient, I would say. Another way we can do it would be to use Lottie. We build the animation with After Effects, and we simply run it using the Lottie component. And another way we can do it, as it was suggested by someone from a subscriber of the show, the same animation can be done by overlaying 4 circles on top of each other and using a simple animation values to move the circles around and producing the same exact effect. So this is a pretty fun game to play because there is these animations and effects we're trying to achieve, and we need to come up with a way to build this animation using primitives from React Native that we know are very performant. So that is the rule of the game. 60 frames per second, even on low-grade Android devices, using declarative gestures and animations. If we cannot declare it, we try to be clever about it. Now, let's look at some of the recipes and patterns, common patterns that emerged while doing the show. The first one is my favorite one, and I learned it from Brent, and I call it hidden scroll views. So here again, the card examples. The very first time I came across this animation, I was scratching my head. I was not sure how to implement it. And then I Googled something like React Native Apple Wallet animation. Sure enough, the first result on Google was a Git repository from Brent. In fact, I actually had a very spooky summer. I worked on a very, very cool React Native project. And every time I would Google something related to React Native, first result would be either a Git issue, Git repositories, you name it from Brent. Very, very scary. So here we have the scroll view, which is hidden, overlaid on top of the cards. We use it to get the Y animated values, and then in the cards components, we're going to interpolate from this value to build the animation. Let's look at another example. This is from the Flutter example gallery. And when you look at such animations, at first, it kind of look pretty scary to, how would you implement this? There's a lot going on, lots of things moving. And when you can use hidden scroll views, life can be easy. So for instance, here we overlay 2 nested scroll views on top of each other. They're going to give us the X and Y animated value. And then in the sections components, we pass these values as properties, and we're going to use them to interpolate all the translations and so on, which you see on the left-hand side. So now we really broke down the problem into 2 pieces, which are not so complex anymore. Why do I love hidden scroll views so much? Gestures in React Native are pretty low level. They have a high barrier to entry. And scroll views are high level. And they give you a lot of things for free. Handling of the gesture state, snap points, and so on. When we can use scroll views, life is good. And we can use scroll views for more gestures than you think. Next up, React Native gesture, handler, and reanimated. Without these 2 libraries, the spectrum of what can be done in React Native would be quite small, and my videos would be quite boring. These 2 libraries enable you to declare animations and gestures at 60 FPS, even on low-grade Android devices. Reanimated is a low-level library, so it has also a high barrier to entry, but it's an extremely rewarding library to use. So I definitely recommend you check out Michael's workshop tomorrow on this topic. And by the way, Evan, I'm waiting for you to make a video of me featuring a video of you. Talking about things which make the spectrum of what can be done in React Native larger, let's talk about SVG animations. The SVG support in React Native through React Native SVG is great, and it plays extremely well with animated values. So here we have an example from the Google Chrome app. So we have this ellipsis animations, which works pretty well with reanimated. So we can use all the math functions from reanimated to calculate how the animation should look like. On this example, I would like to say two things. First, it's really overwhelming to take a step back to the stack we are looking at here. So we have SVG, gesture handler, and reanimated playing well together. Thanks to Expo, we can build and deploy these examples with a web-like agility, and hopefully maybe in the web as well. And thanks to React Native, we can build such example using nothing else but web development skills. I find it extremely exciting. The second thing I would like to mention is, again, looking at this animation, it might look complex to implement, but actually we can really break it down to small digestible pieces. So here we have this ellipsis animation that goes from one button to the other. How would we do this in React Native? One thing that seems difficult to implement is that we have a transition from one button to the other, even though the gesture is still active. So you don't see that a lot actually in mobile animations and gestures. So it seems to be tricky. So first we would remove this part of the equation, do it without, and then once we did it, see how we can implement the transition. So how would we animate this ellipsis? First, let's write it using imperative code in JavaScript, case by case. If index is 0, we do this. If index is 1, we do this. We use set native props to set the values to the ellipsis and see if it works. If it works, maybe we can try to factorize the common patterns we see and come up with a more generic way to implement the animation value for any position of the index. If this works, now it's time to translate this imperative code into a reanimated declaration. So this is the same code from the previous slide, but written in reanimated. And if this works, the solution of how to implement the transition from one button to the other will reveal itself. So here we see that we basically have two animated values which are important to us, the active index of the button and the center variable, which is based on the offset of the finger on the screen. And here these values are treated as discrete values we use set. So if we start to treat them as continuous values using a Spring function, for instance, we would get this nice transition from one button to the other. So again, here this is the same code snippet, but instead of treating index and center as discrete values, they are treated as continuous values, which we can animate over. I really like these puzzles and these problems that we need to break down into small and digestible pieces. Last but not least, let's talk about 3D animations. We implemented a couple of 3D animations in the YouTube channel. When Evan started to talk about the Instagram cube animation, I started to sweat. I was like, oh my gosh. But so this works well on iOS. They're getting a little bit more tricky to do on Android because we usually, these animations depend on these animations require us to have complete control over the perspective of the scene. And on Android with React Native, we don't have such control. I spent a lot of time in Android implementation of transform to try to reverse engineer the perspective transformations, I think, which are applied to views on React Native, and I couldn't figure out a way to control perspective on Android. So these examples are definitely a bit more tricky to have pixel perfect on Android. when you do regular React Native development, you will barely never notice that there are some differences on Android and iOS regarding the view component. But when you start doing these 3D animations, it starts to become clearer. I guess one solution would be to use a GL view instead, and then you would implement all the features of the view component into the GL view. And I guess that if you do that, you will have invented Flutter or something. I don't know. But people have suggested that my goal with the YouTube series is to prove that everything can be done in React Native. But I actually find it to be much more interesting to look at things that cannot be done in React Native, or at least spend time on the edges of what can be done. And these 3D transformations are definitely on the edge of what is doable. Now, let's look at an example together. But let's look at a to-do app, but not any regular to-do app. Let's look at an award-winning to-do app. This is a Clear app on iOS. And this is a gesture and animation to create a new task. I think it looks really cool. So you see you have a nice 3D folding of the task. The text is folded as well in 3 dimensions. It looks very nice. And how would we do this in React Native? So first, we would use the pinch gesture handler from React Native gesture handler to implement the pinch gesture. And when the gesture begins, we're going to store the y coordinate of the focal point, because this is going to allow us to compute the number of items that need to translate to the top and the number of items that need to translate to the bottom. And we can use reanimated to interpolate the color of the item. So we need to know if I create an item on the top, it's going to be red. If it's at the bottom, it's going to be yellow. And then we need to do this fancy 3D animation. And we can implement it by overlaying 2 identical views on top of each other. We apply some perspective to the scene, and one of the views is going to rotate on the x-axis from 0 to 90 degrees, and one is going to rotate from 0 to minus 90 degrees. And finally, we need to apply a translate z transformation, which we can get by applying some simple trigonometry. And since there is no translate z in React Native, we can simply convert this transform into a scale transformation using the perspective value. So here is again a case where on iOS you have perfect control over the perspective. It's going to look pixel perfect. But on Android, because we don't have this control over perspective, it's not going to look pixel perfect. So guys, what do you think? Can it be done in React Native? Let's have a look. So here is the actual implementation. We use the, maybe I can make that bigger. We use the pinch gesture handler to drive the gesture. When the gesture begins, we store the y coordinate of the focal value. We have a spring function when we release the gesture. And we use this focal y value to compute the index, and index is going to enable us to find out if the item needs to translate to the top or the bottom. So here I'm looping over my task, and I know if the index needs to be translated to the top or the bottom. So I'm going to multiply the scale factor by 1 or minus 1. We also use reanimated to interpolate the color of the task. So based on the animation value, we know what should be the background color of the task. And then, for the 3D transformation, we use the technique that we just described on the slide. So we have two identical views, which are overlaid on top of each other. We have the isOnTop property that we use to know if we need to translate, to rotate to 90 degrees or minus 90 degrees. If we look at this component, here are the three transformations that we described in the slide: perspective, rotate, so either from minus 90 or 90, and the translate X transformation, which we convert into a scale transformation. So, and the last transformation, we have some opacity overlay to add some shadow effect to the two collapsing views. So let's have a look. So I can pinch, so you see, it falls nicely, 3 dimension, can pinch, and then, so it's, I mean, can you even tell the difference from the original app? I think it looks pretty close. Thank you. Now I would like to thank you for your support to the channel, and thank you for your time today. This was Can It Be Done in React Native? Thank you.